So, all right, Alex, it's a pleasure to sit down with you. Obviously, we're here to talk about Sexplanation, the documentary you've been working on. Um, you've talked a little bit about the challenges that, in the press and in the materials, but in your own words right now, what were some of the biggest challenges in pulling the documentary together? Obviously, there was some awkward conversations with your family. There was the fMRI as well. Tell me about some of that stuff and how challenging that was for you, even with all of your experience.
Yeah, I think, at the beginning of the process, there was no way I would have told my coming out story. There was no way I would have talked to my parents on camera. I really envisioned this much more as just like the sexiest educational video you could watch, right? It was very much like a more of a straightforward explainer piece. But what happened, as we started getting a lot of these interviews, we would edit them and they'd be very interesting, but it was very clear very, very quickly there was no emotional core to what we were cutting to keep people's engagement unless you were already engaged. And what we were trying to do is get all people to understand that sexual shame isn't just a queer thing. It's not just a female thing. We all live with some measure of sexual shame, and it's hurting us. It's hurting us all. It's hurting our culture. It's hurting society. So I have some amazing creative partners who, when they were asking me through the process, like, why do you actually want to do this? Like, what is the actual, artistic impetus? And I would go into these long, tirades about my upbringing and how I never wanted another kid to go through what I went through and my family went through, even though we were pretty liberal, we had to deal with a lot of these things as it was uncomfortable for us. And I think by the third or fourth time I co-wrote early, I was like, well, maybe this is the movie. So I think that was definitely the hardest part, to get me to talk about suicidal ideation, talk about disconnection from my parents, talk about just the real damage and trauma. But once we did that, and once it started to flow a lot faster, and I think it was a 7-year process. There's a lot of therapy also involved in that process. But I think, yeah, that was those little building blocks. There's only 12 interviews in the film, but we interviewed probably 50 people. So it's like coming out of the closet. The first time you ask your question about sexual shame or a secret you have or a desire you've never admitted to anyone, it's terrifying. But by the 50th interview, it's like, okay, yeah, I like to masturbate to stepdad porn. It just flows off the tongue, right? So it was a long 7-year process to get to that point. But yeah. So just being open and vulnerable it's a challenge for everyone, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, that comes across in the trailer and in the materials is, again, how open and honest you've had to be. And obviously, you mentioned the therapy there. That's a difficult thing for anyone to confront in themselves, especially when you're putting it out to the world as well.
Yeah.
So as comfortable, as obviously, remain safe and comfortable as you talk about it. But how difficult was that for you to confront your own background regarding sex? Because, that could be motivational for a lot of young people and a lot of people of all ages, genders, sexualities, who are going through the same thing.
Yeah, I think that the best thing that we've heard from the movie is responses from straight men in decades long relationships who are like, watch the movie and they're like, okay, I didn't even realize how little I was comfortable talking about this with my partner who I've been with for decades. And it started to open up conversations in that relationship that they've never had before, which has been that was our goal, and it's been so great to hear. But yeah, I think it's really, really hard. I think to be vulnerable in any sense is difficult. And then especially when you grow up in a culture where silence is the norm, where, I can remember in middle school, someone talking about how he enjoyed anal pleasure, prostate pleasure. And that was like the story of his life until he graduated high school. That was a thing he was ridiculed for. So it's very quickly, I think you see, if you step outside of these boundaries, how quickly society slaps you down. It's so different now than it was 30 years ago. But I still think there's a lot of that going on that we don't even realize. And so you almost need that objective observer to listen to you talk about things, to catch the things that you don't know. And I think, again, it's baby steps. You can't just all of a sudden, coming out of the closet for me was not like a one day I was out and one day I was in and one day I was out. It was this leaving little clues and breadcrumbs for friends, and then the friends are asking questions, and you finally build up the courage. So I think, it is a courageous step you have to take. It is something that you'll have to live in fear for a little bit. But if you really do the work, the everyday work, I mean, just the how much more beautiful and meaningful, fulfilled your life becomes, especially around sex. I mean, sex is one of the things that, like, you know, after good sex, the world is so much brighter and more beautiful. I mean, you feel more connected and loving and patient, all the things that we want as a society. So it's something that I think is definitely worth the resources and effort. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, you know, again, you mentioned obviously it's a journey of discovery for a lot of people, not just yourself. You've worked on documentaries before, you've done things before, you know, in terms of, you know, interviewing people and things like that. How did this documentary change you as a person? What have you learned about yourself from the very beginning? You mentioned quite a few years of work on this from the very beginning, and the person you were at the very beginning. How have you changed and developed through building this documentary?
Yeah, I love that question. So it's I think at the beginning of this process, it was much more of like a pun intended, masturbatory exercise in like my anger, right? I was out. My initial impulse was to like show these people who have been causing so much suffering for me and others why they're wrong, how they're wrong, and really attacking them head on. But through the process and through the editing process, I started to see that, you know, the way I was approaching things, you know, I was being hypocritical in many ways. I was asking for the world to love and accept me for who I am, listen to me non-judgmentally, especially the other side. And then those are the three things I was not willing to do, like myself, you know. So if how can I expect that in return if I'm not willing to give it myself? And so that's been the biggest kind of self-discovery that I've made, is that it is totally worth the tremendous amount of emotional energy it takes to listen non-judgmentally to people you disagree with.
Yeah,
it's a huge skill to develop, but it's the only way you will actually be heard. Because if you come in hot, if you come in with an agenda, if you, other than listening, if you come in to attack, there's just no way another person would ever consider letting their guard down, right? That if you want those vulnerable moments where people are actually listening to each other and actually shifting their perspective, you have to do the same. So it's a lot of biting your tongue, holding your tongue, listening, thinking, not reacting immediately. That's been the biggest thing where I'm like, okay, I know now, like, kind of that's the only way forward, and that's how I kind of see things.
I noticed in the trailer and so again the materials, some of the interviews you were doing, you know, again you come across a lot of times very enthusiastic, but some of the interviews you were doing, you were really thinking. There was some stern looks, you know what I mean? Obviously some disagreements in terms of values with some of your interview subjects, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I loved every interview we put in, and all the interviews we didn't put in there. I came away from every interview just so much lighter and freer, and like the world gets, you know, when you have your perspective shift in a way that feels more authentic, it's just such a like life affirming, life opening, beautiful way to live, I think. But the interviews that really do stick with me, that really changed me the most, are the ones with the people who I have a very strong disagreement about the worldview. I'm an atheist, progressive atheist. So talking to a Catholic priest about sex changed how I see it. He actually made me realize that, you know, there is a place for this spiritual kind of moral, you know, I would even say religious thinking, but of course institutions have just proven themselves untrustworthy. But there is a point, and if only they could see that there is a place for them if they just kept up with the times. And speaking with conservative, you know, politicians who I disagree with, you know, I actually enjoyed those conversations, hearing from them, listening to what they're saying, and having an actual back and forth, something that, you know, in my liberal bubble is very rare. So I think that's been just something I want to have more of. Yeah.
A testament to your work as a journalist as well in developing it, Alex. So congratulations on again the diversity and what you've been able to do. I think being outside of the US, you know, being in the UK and watching, you know, the research that's gone into it, some of the things, you know, that you uncovered, you know, and obviously some of the facts that you've released. You know, only 17 states require sex education to be medically accurate. 7 states require teaching homosexuality is bad, I believe. That was 2020 with some of those stats. Yeah. And I think that to me as an outsider, baffles me completely. I think, if I was to sort of say to you, if you were in control of the curriculum, if you were in control of what was taught in schools and things like that, what are some of the things that you would like to see young people being taught, being educated on?
Yeah, so there's a long list, but I think the ultimate kind of framing I would have around sex education right now in the U.S., what we really have is pregnancy and disease education, right? And maybe puberty education too. Um, and they're designed to fit a specific public health goal, which is reduce teenage pregnancy and reduce disease, which are great goals to have. But it's not really sex education, right? And so I think the overarching frame of sex education in the US should focus first and foremost on the fact that sex is good, sex is normal. The sex you have might look different than what's typical, but it's completely normal in terms of the diversity of like the human species. And that the ultimate goal of sex education should be, how do we make sure the kids, when they get to adulthood, have all the tools and skills they need to have the most pleasurable and risk-free, risk-free, but low-risk sexual experiences, right? How do they actually build a life, the relationships that they want? People often will say like, sex is frivolous. Like, why do you care about this thing? It's, but come on, like the sexual relationships you have in your life are the most defining relationships you'll ever have. So I think to make sure that goes as well as possible is such a societal benefit. So what that looks like, I think, is different for each community, right? I think I do understand the U.S. is very hyper local in its politics, especially around school curricula. But I think the overarching frame has to be pleasure is good, sex is good. How you deal with it, though, could be different. I do think schools do need to, at least in the U.S., do need to frame sex education not as like, we're going to teach your kids the thing and like screw the parents. It has to be like working lockstep with parents, because that's the only way politically this can move forward, is that sex education has to be reinforced over and over and over again as helping parents have difficult conversation with their kids, helping families actually make sure they're connected in this way, and that kids know that parents are the first people they should go to in most cases for this kind of advice. And I think if you can get parents on the side, a lot of this can be unlocked a lot much quicker.
Absolutely, and I mean you've answered perfectly my next question, but I'm still gonna bring it in. One of the most admirable things that you were able to do in that documentary, and I think one of the most universal things in the documentary, is that conversation with your parents. I have had one conversation in my life, and we're the same age with my mum. I've never spoken to my dad about it, and I think one of the most universal things is that conversation. So I mean, is that the primary goal, or one of the primary goals, to not only inspire kids to talk about sex and young people, but also to inspire parents to open up a little more? Certainly that seems the way to me, but again, in your own words.
Yeah, I think what I learned through this process is that sex education at any age never hurts, right? That we all are dealing with our own sense of shame and part in the journey. I think wherever you are is totally fine. But really, we all kind of need this, because it is something that is relatively new, at least in the course of human history. So I think, but people often ask, like, how do I have these conversations with my parents, or like, how do I get my parents to open up? And the fact of the matter is, it could just be that I'm very lucky to have the parents I have that are willing to go with me on this journey, and your parents might not. But it's really just like the people in your life. Like, the thing that makes me the most sad is like someone who's been married or partnered with someone for decades, and they've never actually admitted kind of like their deepest, darkest sexual desires, fantasies, because they're afraid of being shamed or losing that person. And I think that's a fair fear, because I think before doing this documentary, if I had heard from my partner some of these things, I might have freaked out too. So I get that. But the goal is really to get everyone to understand like the tiny little baby steps you make in this process to help you get along the way, along all ages throughout your lifetime, really just makes life so much better. And so that and it makes better not necessarily because your sex will be better, but the sex you have probably will be better, but because you can just be open and authentic and free with the people you love, right? There's no greater feeling than community, right? That sense of belonging. And if you're afraid you won't belong because of this thing that you can't control, your sexuality, that's just a terrible burden to have. That's just so much emotional energy wasted. But if you could let go of that, and the people you love the most see you for who you are, and you feel that love, oh, that's just heaven.
It's beautiful, man. And I think that, that thanks are in order, because it has made me think, could I have that conversation? I'm very fortunate to have very supportive parents, and it's made me think, could I have that conversation, around these things with my parents and my wider friendship group? And I have, very lucky in my life to have the support, but we've just never had that conversation. So it's inspired me to think about whether I could do that. And I believe, from watching the trailer and the resources of your documentary, that I could do that. So that certainly is something I'm going to look at doing more, more in the future.
Great. And remember this, I was a 7-year process, baby steps. So my advice often is like, if you don't feel comfortable talking about your own personal life, talk about something in the news, talk about something you read, talk about something. Have you heard about this thing? What do you think about this? Just getting the people comfortable, because it's like sex too, like if you go straight into intercourse, it's not going to be a good experience. You got to warm up. You gotta, you gotta have a little foreplay around that. So the conversations, my advice is always, just start slow, the smallest little baby step you can think of. And in 5, 6, 7 years, you'll be amazed at how fluent you all are.
It's amazing, an amazing process. 4 or 5 more questions now then. I think another one of the coolest things about the documentary is it's interesting to learn about the taboo fantasies and how, a lot of those are considered normal from an expert point of view. Now, I've been quite ashamed about some of the things that I've been into over the years. And I think, it's a revelation that actually a lot of this stuff is normal, at least from an expert point of view. And I'm getting that, that was interesting for you to learn as well.
Yeah, I learned it's normal, almost to the point of boring, actually. like that we all have, taboo is something we love to play with. Think about all the movies. How many movies have I seen about serial killers? How many movies have I seen about Fast and the Furious racing or all these taboo movies we love, but we somehow think porn is like this separate sense of media. It's all part of the same media landscape, right? Like we're intrigued by the taboo, the controversial. How do we play it out? How do we think it through? I will say, I think one of the best kind of framing shifts I've had around sex is like, we're all concerned if we're normal or not, right? And I almost think that's a useless word, and only in the sense that that the only thing normal about all of us is that we're all different. Like no one has the exact same set of sexual kinks, quirks, and desires, right? We're all a little different in some way. So the only normal experience really is that experience of being different. And I think maybe a better way to think about it is typical, atypical, but it's all in the realm of normal. That what's normal is that we're all atypical in some way. And so yeah, I think if you can think it, you can fantasize about it. And so it's been just such a wonderful journey to be able to kind of talk about these things publicly, and just the more you talk about it, you realize, oh man, like this is very common.
Yeah. I think as long as you're not hurting anybody, and you're having a good time, I think that's fantastic.
One thing I will say about porn, though, is a lot of people ask me about this. Like, so you're saying all porn is good, and I think we have to separate out a lot of different things. Like the concept or the idea of pornography, I don't think there's nothing ethically wrong about that. We've been painting people having sex on cave walls. This is a fabric of who we are. We enjoy depictions of humans having sex. The problems come in is how those depictions are made, right? So I think much like Hollywood has gone through a huge reckoning in terms of how they pay their performers, how they pay crew members, what kind of faces and bodies and gender identities get expressed on screen. All these things I think porn still needs to go through. So I think there is a valid point that the porn being produced now is highly exploitative and has some shady business practices, but that doesn't mean porn in and of itself is somehow inherently wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting note. And I think, I do want to ask you as well, because for me, so I have cerebral palsy. So I think one of the reasons why I haven't necessarily talked too much about my, sexual journey with friends and family is because I've spent so much time defending over the years, people insulting me or saying that I'm not going to be able to have girlfriends or partners or whatever.
Oh
And
man.
I'm very, very happy to now be able to do that and to have a wonderful partner and have I've had some wonderful experiences in my life. But part of my day job is that I work with young people who are in a similar situation. Maybe they've got a disability or a difference, some mental health issues, and they are really down on themselves. But they want to educate people. They want to inform people. Take those baby steps. But perhaps they don't have the resources or reputation that you do, and the connections in order to make something like Sexplanation happen. So, what would be your advice for any young person who is going through that, struggling to find their identity and dealing with some of the similar things I mentioned, who want to create a documentary, they want to get resources together, but they're struggling to find the resources to do these things and to be able to, they're inspired by, for example, what you've done, but they perhaps don't right now have the resources to do it.
I mean, totally. I'm hesitating a little because I don't want to sugarcoat things. It's difficult. It is very hard. Putting together something like this, it took 7 years for a reason, and a lot of it was financial resources. But I think one of the best things about social media and the internet and YouTube, there are a lot of things I have issues with, is a lot of this stuff I was just putting online. And that was kind of how I got my first kind of sense of a little bit of a fan base. And I think, working with friends, working with partners, putting together something that you can kind of do on your own DIY is now it's easier than ever. So I would say if you really have a perspective you want to get out there, if you really want to have your voice out there, do what you can, cobble together what you can, beg as many friends, family, loved ones to help. You'll be amazed who will actually turn up for you, show up for you. And just start posting things online. It is, to do something like this is somewhat of a sacrifice, but if you keep at it, you'd be amazed. When I look back at my videos 10, 12 years ago, I'm embarrassed because they're so, to me, awful, but you have to start somewhere. So I think, even if it's just on your phone and you're just talking to camera, if you come from an open, honest, vulnerable place, and honestly, if you're going to put yourself out there, make sure you do have the emotional resources, tools to deal with what comes at you, because there is a lot of crap that will come at you. But if you have that all in place, it's kind of a crazy journey you might find yourself on 10 years later.
It's exciting, and again, it simplifies it down. If you can, some of the most powerful messages have been delivered from a smartphone, to YouTube and things like that. So it does simplify it down for people, and I think that's some great advice. 2 more questions now before we do the plugging bit. I want to know a little bit more about yourself. Obviously, you have had to stay motivated to create this over many years. Can you tell me about some of the passions you have outside of work, outside of creating documentaries? Who is it, the people, places that motivate you, that keep you going?
Yeah, I'm laughing a little because it just feels like this has been my whole life for the last couple of years. But I think, another piece of advice I would have for someone who wants to do this is also make sure you understand it. In many ways, this is a lottery, like that. Success you have to define in your own terms, which is difficult, but the idea of like just having 50 people see something, that can be a success. And I think the other part of having to manage a career like this definitely is around making sure you build a life outside that is of meaning and value. Because if you derive all your meaning from work or the whims of social media, like it's a tough dragon to chase. So yeah, I think it's things like getting outdoors in nature. I love kayaking, going on hikes, that sort of thing. Or it's just, make sure you carve out that time for friends and family, for dinners or brunches, or even if it's just watching a movie, or making sure you have that kind of out there. I mean, I'm a big movie TV buff, so that's something that I love to get into, and just to see kind of the most, indie, innovative kind of films out there. But yeah, I think I'm lucky in the sense that I've been able to find some people who have been really amazing support, because ultimately when it boils down to it, the reason I love this type of work is when you get into real conversations, like the conversations you have maybe only with your closest friends over a intimate dinner, that's where I feel like life is really, really, really sizzles. And so that's kind of where I love to spend most of my time.
Absolutely. And I'm glad to hear it as well. That balance, that work-life balance is key, I think, in the creative industries for
It's
sure.
tough, yeah, but if you can manage it, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what is your message then to, obviously we're in the UK, people are going to be able to check the documentary out. What is your message to those people that have supported the documentary, supported you, the crew, the awarding bodies, of course, very successful out there in the world, this documentary. So what is the message to those that have supported you and those that are yet to discover the documentary, and will support you in the future?
Oh, I mean, the overwhelming gratitude I have, I can never fully express. People took a lot of chances on me and gave me money, not knowing if they would ever see the end product, supported me, not knowing how I would use their money and to put something together. It could have been a really bad idea to do this in many ways. And so that's something I'm still fully processing, because it's just it's just kind of blows my mind in many ways that I'm at this point right now. But yeah, I think for the future, the people who are supporting the doc, my one goal for all of this, my measure of success for this movie, is how many new open conversations people could have with the loved ones in their lives about something that's very important to them. That can I actually put something into the world that could have a multiplying effect on getting people to love themselves, and in turn be easier to love others in a way that I think is the only way that we survive as a species. So I think that's kind of my message of the film, and I hope you come away with it with a newfound understanding of why sex is good, why sex is important, and why a sexier future is something we should all be fighting for.
Absolutely, absolutely. I obviously very excited about your future as well. What obviously there'll be some projects you can't tell me about, but what have you got lined up? What's next for you? What are your plans?
Yeah, I would love to take this. We kind of, because of COVID, we kind of never took this on a tour. So I would love to go like in the southern states, the states that have
Yeah.
bad sex education, to take them from. But yeah, I think, again, like I said, there were so many interviews in the film that didn't make the cut. We joked that Queer Kink could be the next documentary, because there's so many. We realized really early on that, like, to do queer issues justice, to do trans issues justice, to do gender issues justice, to do some other religious issues justice, it needed way more time. So we would love to put that into another documentary. History of sex, we talked a lot of great historians around that. And I actually am interested in kind of maybe as a companion piece, something around love, because I think that's another topic that I'm just realizing how much I need to develop that skill, and how much it is an active skill rather than just a feeling. So those are kind of the things that are swirling around my brain right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure. I was so happy when
Likewise.
that information landed in my inbox. I think what you're doing is amazing. It's
Thank you.
certainly helped me to have some discussions, now and in the future. So, I can't thank you enough for that, and I hope for the absolute best for you and the documentary going
Oh,
forward.
likewise. I'm just honored you took the time to listen. This was a really fun, amazing conversation. So thank you.